Dreamtime history for sleep.
We were always told that the peaks of Mount Olympus were a sanctuary of pristine marble and eternal gold, a place where the gods feasted on nectar and laughed at the petty, flickering lives of mortals below. We were told that the union of Zeus and Hera was the unbreakable bedrock of the universe, the sacred celestial bond of the king and queen that kept the stars in their courses and the seasons in their rhythmic dance. We were told that their love was the prototype for every vow ever whispered in the dark. But that was a lie. The air on the summit today doesn't smell of sweet incense or roasting sacrificial meats. It smells of the sharp, metallic tang of ozone, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up seconds before a killing strike. It smells of bruised lilies and the suffocating, cloying scent of crushed peacock feathers and burnt honey. There is a vibration in the floorboards of the world, a low, rhythmic thrumming that makes the temples in Athens shudder and the wine in the cups of kings turn to vinegar. This isn't a holy assembly of the divine. This is a crime scene, and the victim is the very idea of forever. Look at the throne room. The great ivory seats, carved from the sun-bleached bones of monsters older than time, have been heaved aside as if they were nothing but kindling. A massive golden goblet has shattered against the far wall, the ambrosia dripping down the exquisite frieze like divine ichor, staining the carved images of ancient victories. And there, standing in the center of the devastation, is a woman whose silence is louder than any thunderclap Zeus has ever hurled. Hera does not scream. That's the terrifying part. She stands with her shoulders squared, her regal veil torn and fluttering in a wind that shouldn't exist indoors. Her eyes do not reflect the shimmering blue of the Aegean. They reflect the cold, jagged gray of a winter gale hitting a rocky cliff. She is the goddess of marriage, the protector of the sacred hearth, and she is currently watching her own house burn to the ground. She is looking at the man across from her, the king of gods, the cloud gatherer, the master of the heavens, and for the first time in 3 millennia, she isn't seeing a husband. She is seeing a husband shay of ego and 1,000 broken promises. And Zeus, he looks smaller than he did yesterday. He stands there with a lightning bolt half-formed in his grip, his knuckles white, his majestic beard singed at the edges. He's searching for the words, the same silver-tongued lies he's used since the dawn of the Iron Age. He wants to talk about fate. He wants to explain how his latest tryst with a nymph or a queen or a golden shower of coins was just a momentary lapse of spark in the dark. He's waiting for her to do what she always does, to plot a subtle revenge, to punish the girl, and to eventually return to his side so the cosmos can keep spinning. But the status quo just died. You can feel it in the way the wind has suddenly stopped blowing over the Mediterranean. You can hear it in the way the muses have gone deafeningly silent. Hera reaches up with a steady hand and unfastens the golden diadem from her brow, the symbol of her queenship, the weight she has carried through eons of public humiliation and private betrayal. She lets it fall. It hits the marble floor with a sound that echoes through every underworld and every heaven. It's the sound of a tether snapping. This wasn't just another spat. This wasn't a fit of jealous rage. This was the moment the sky decided it no longer needed the earth. This was the day the Queen of Heaven realized that her throne was a cage and her husband was her jailer. The world is trembling because for the first time in eternity, the gods aren't fighting a war against titans or giants. They are fighting a war against each other. And as the first real rain starts to fall black, heavy, and freezing, you realize that nothing will ever be the same again. Welcome to the end of an era. Welcome to the most catastrophic, soul-crushing breakup in the history of existence. Imagine a world where the sun refuses to set, trapped in a permanent amber afternoon. For 300 years, the island of Samos was the only place in existence. There was no Olympus, no humanity, and no war. There was only the scent of crushed saffron and the heavy, humid perfume of lilies that bloomed only in the presence of divinity. Hera lay in the center of this golden haze, her fingers entwined with the man who had turned himself into a cuckoo just to feel the warmth of her breast. He wasn't a king then, he was a husband, and for 3 centuries, even the sun stood still. Time is a mortal plaything, but for the gods, it is a canvas. They painted 300 years of absolute suffocating devotion across the Aegean. Zeus didn't look at the stars. He looked at the way the light caught the Brahms in Hera's hair. Every breath she drew was a command to the winds to remain silent. It was a honeymoon that reshaped the geography of pleasure, a marathon of celestial ecstasy where the boundaries between their bodies blurred until Hera couldn't tell if the thunder was his heartbeat or her own. But even the longest summer must eventually face the coming of the first cold breeze. The transition from the marriage bed to the throne was draped in silk and iron. When they finally ascended to Olympus, the world bowed so low the mountains groaned. Hera stepped onto the peak, not as a bride, but as an architect of order. She donned the symbols of her station, the peacock, whose feathers shimmered with 100 unblinking eyes, and the lotus-tipped scepter that hummed with the power to bind and to loose. She thought these were tools of her sovereignty, jewels to highlight her status as the absolute equal of the Thunderer. She didn't know yet that the eyes on her peacock's tail were meant to watch him, not the world. Her scepter was carved from the wood of a tree that had never known shadow, tipped with a golden flower that radiated the heat of 1,000 suns. When she held it, she felt the pulse of every marriage bed in the cosmos, every vow whispered in the dark, every legal contract signed in blood. She was the glue holding the universe together. Zeus sat beside her, his hand resting on her knee, his lightning bolts leaning casually against his throne like discarded toys. For a moment, the symmetry was perfect. They were the sun and the moon, the storm and the hearth, but the king of gods was already bored with the perfection of a goddess. The golden wedding began to tarnish the moment Zeus realized that a queen is a witness, and a witness is a judge. The 300-year honeymoon had been a vacuum, a space where his whims were her only reality. Now, the world was back. The mortals were scurrying like ants below, and their tragedies were so much more interesting than the eternal radiance of his wife. Hera watched his gaze shift from her face to the horizon, a subtle tilt of the head that signaled the end of an era. It was the first time she felt the weight of her crown, and it felt like a leaden brand. She tried to bring him back to Samos with a touch, a whisper of the lilies, but the scent had evaporated. The peacock eyes on her robes began to twitch, sensing a disturbance in the ether that Hera's heart refused to acknowledge. Zeus started leaving the throne room for walks that lasted decades. He spoke of administrative duties, of titans stirring in the pits of Tartarus, of the necessity of divine intervention in the mud-caked lives of men. He was weaving a tapestry of excuses, and each thread was a lie she could taste like copper on her tongue. The sky turned the color of a bruise. The realization hit her not as a lightning bolt, but as a slow, freezing realization. The throne wasn't a seat of power. It was a pedestal designed to keep her stationary while he roamed. The symbols of her authority, the scepter, the crown, the sacred peacock, were the bars of a cage, gilded in the highest grade of celestial gold. She was the queen of heaven, but she was the only one in the palace who couldn't leave. As the first drop of black rain splashed against the marble floor, Hera looked at her husband and saw a stranger. The honeymoon was officially over. The air on Olympus used to taste of ambrosia and sun-warmed linen, but today it carried the metallic, suffocating tang of a coming storm. Hera's fingers, tipped with nails the color of polished pearl, tightened around the lotus-topped scepter until her knuckles turned a ghostly white. It felt heavy, not with the weight of sovereignty, but with the density of a leaden anchor dragging her into the depths. Below her the clouds churned, bruised purples and sickly ochres, swirling where there should have been eternal, crystalline blue. A single drop of liquid, dark as a bruised plum, fell from the vaulted ceiling, splashing against the pristine white marble. It didn't belong here. She followed the ripple of the liquid as it stained the floor, a jagged line creeping toward her sandaled feet like an invading army. Her crown, a circle of celestial gold encrusted with starfire, pulsed against her temples with a rhythmic, throbbing ache. It wasn't a halo of light, it was a shackle of responsibility. She looked at the peacock perched on the ivory balustrade, its 1,000 eyes blinking in a terrifying, silent unison, reflecting her own wide-eyed realization of isolation. Every eye saw the same thing, a queen sitting on a pedestal while the king's seat remained cold, the air around it devoid of his usual electric hum. He was gone, and he hadn't left through the gates. She leaned forward, the heavy silk of her chiton rustling like dry autumn leaves against the unyielding stone. She searched the cavernous hall for the scent of ozone and singed air that always preceded his presence, the smell of raw, untamed power. Instead, she caught a fleeting whiff of something terrestrial crushed wild mint, damp earth and the salty, pungent spray of a distant mortal sea. The realization didn't hit her with the violence of a lightning bolt. It seeped into her bones like a slow, frigid poison. This palace, with its soaring colonnades and floors of translucent glass, was designed so that she would always be the center of the world, provided she never moved. She was the fixed point. A hairline fracture appeared in the marble right between her feet, a thin, jagged vein of shadow splitting the reflection of the ceiling. It was silent, yet it felt like a scream echoing through the foundations of the mountain. She realized then that the throne was not a reward for her loyalty or a seat of shared dominion, but a stake driven into the heart of the earth to keep her pinned. The jewels in her scepter felt like frozen tears, cold and unfeeling against her palms. She stood, the movement foreign and stiff, and as she rose, the very mountain seemed to groan in a low, subterranean protest. Then, from the mortal realm far below, came a sound. It was a laugh, muffled by leagues of atmosphere and the thickness of the clouds, but unmistakable in its booming, thunderous joy. It wasn't the controlled laugh of a king presiding over a divine council. It was the wild, reckless laugh of a predator who had found a new, forbidden playground. Hera walked to the edge of the precipice, her footsteps echoing like steady drumbeats in an empty, gilded tomb. She looked down through the veil of clouds, her divine sight piercing the mist to find a golden eagle circling a wooded glade in Arcadia. The eagle dived with predatory grace, its talons reaching for something soft, something human, something that was absolutely not a queen. Her heart, once a forge of steady, protective heat, turned into a block of jagged obsidian. The we she had carefully built during the celestial honeymoon, the shared nectar, the whispered promises of a shared eternity, shattered into 1,000 pieces of useless glass. She looked at her hands and saw they were trembling, not with the tremors of fear, but with the pressurized force of a rising, catastrophic tide. The golden embroidery on her robe seemed to tighten, the thread of light stitching becoming a suffocating web of confinement. He was a stranger who wore her husband's face, a god who used his divinity as a skeleton key for every door but hers. The black rain began to fall in earnest now, pockmarking the silver pools of the courtyard and drenching the sacred lilies. Hera didn't retreat into the dry safety of the inner sanctum, or call for her attendants to bring a cloak. She let the dark, oily water soak into her hair, washing away the lingering scent of sacred incense and honey. She realized that the Queen of Heaven was merely a title meant to keep her eyes fixed on the distant stars so she wouldn't notice him crawling through the terrestrial mud. The honeymoon wasn't over because of a simple quarrel. It was over because the foundation of their world was built on a lie. She raised her hand, and the sky finally screamed. The air near the grove of Mycenae didn't just vibrate, it hummed with the collective, rhythmic blink of 100 heavy lids. Argus Panoptes was not a man, but a biological surveillance system made of wet, lidless apertures and tireless devotion. He stood over the white heifer, the trembling, transmuted remains of Zeus's latest obsession like a living cage of flesh and sight. Some eyes tracked the crawling ants in the dirt, others mapped the circular flight of the hawk, and several peered into the very marrow of the poor beast's bones. He never slept. He couldn't. Even when his mind drifted into the numbing fog of boredom, 40 pupils remained dilated, fixed, and unyielding upon his charge. He was the Queen's perfect, unblinking weapon, a sentinel of pure observation. But then a low, haunting flute began to play. The melody was a syrupy, narcotic thing, weaving through the gnarled olive branches like a golden viper looking for a kill. Hermes, the divine thief, moved with a stride that made no sound upon the parched, dry earth. He looked like a common shepherd, dusty and worn, yet his staff held the terrifying weight of a god's desperation. He sat beside the multi-eyed giant, the notes of his reed pipe vibrating against the creature's thick, gray hide. Argus, lonely in his eternal silent vigilance, leaned closer to the sound, his many brows furrowing in curiosity. He craved the story within the song, the narrative arc that might break the monotony of his existence. One by one, the 100 circles of amber and sapphire began to grow heavy, their focus blurring into a soft gray haze. One eye remained open. That final eye, positioned just above the giant's temple, flickered with the stubbornness of a dying candle in a gale. It saw the shepherd's hand tighten on the hilt of a hidden, curved blade. It saw the way the grass didn't bend under the visitor's feet, betraying his celestial weight. Argus tried to roar, to alert the Queen of Heaven that her prisoner was being stolen and her favorite guard was failing, but the music was a physical weight. It pressed his heavy lids shut like stones being rolled onto the mouth of a tomb. The melody climbed to a haunting final crescendo, a lullaby specifically designed to murder the senses. The last spark of consciousness retreated into the dark, leaving the giant defenseless. Hermes drew the curved sickle. The blow was a silent, silver arc of pure finality. It didn't just sever a head, it extinguished an entire galaxy of perception in a single, wet stroke. The 100 eyes rolled into the dust, staring at nothing as the blood seeped into the thirsty soil, dark and heavy as divine wine. The white heifer let out a low, mournful lowing, her large, bovine eyes reflecting the carnage of her fallen guardian. Hermes didn't linger to pray for the dead or to mourn the loss of such a unique being. He had a mistress to free and a king's guilty conscience to appease. But the silence that followed the music was not empty. It was the terrifying sound of Hera's fury descending from the high peak of Olympus. Her sandals didn't touch the ground, they scorched it. Hera arrived in a whirlwind of peacock blue silk and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. She knelt in the dirt, her fingers trembling with a rare, cold grief as she touched the cooling gray skin of her most loyal servant. Argus had been the only creature in the cosmos who didn't lie to her, mainly because he had no mouth to speak, only 100 eyes to witness the truth. She looked at the scattered, dulling orbs in the dirt, the lights of his devotion fading into the gray film of death. Zeus thought he had won a tactical victory by silencing her witness. He thought he had erased the evidence of his betrayal. He was wrong. She gathered the cold, glassy spheres into the folds of her golden robe as if they were the most precious gems in the treasury of the gods. Each one held a fragment of the pain she refused to shed in front of her husband. "You shall never be blind again," she whispered, her voice a tectonic shift beneath the surface of the world. She whistled, a sharp, piercing note that summoned her favorite birds from the royal orchard. The peacocks gathered, their drab, brown tails dragging in the bloody dust, sensing the shift in the cosmic order. She began to press the eyes of the fallen giant into the feathers of the birds, one by one. The transformation was agonizingly beautiful. The plumage erupted into a riot of iridescent greens, royal purples, and shimmering blues. 100 eyes now shimmered on every fan's tail, a permanent, unblinking monument to her husband's cruelty and her own eternal surveillance. No longer would she watch from the shadows or rely on the reports of others. The peacock fanned its tail, a wall of emerald witnesses that would follow Zeus through every bedchamber and every secret grove he dared to frequent. Hera stood tall, the blood of Argus still staining the hem of her gown like a promise. This wasn't just a memorial, it was a declaration of total war. She looked toward the palace where Zeus waited. She was no longer just his wife. The air in Thebes was thick, a humid soup of jasmine and the copper tang of mortal ambition. Hera didn't need the eyes of her peacocks to find him. She followed the stench of divine desperation. In the palace of Cadmus, a girl named Semele preened, her belly swelling with a secret that tasted like lightning. She was young, soft, and utterly convinced she was the exception to the rule of Hera's wrath. Zeus arrived in the shadows, a mere whisper of a man hiding his thunder behind a veil of mortal skin. But Hera was already there, watching. She didn't descend in a chariot of gold. Instead, she chose the skin of Beroe, an ancient nurse with joints that creaked like old cedar. She sat in the corner of Semele's chamber, weaving lies into the wool she spun. Every word was a needle prick. He says he is a king. He says he is the lord of the sky. Hera's voice rasped like dry leaves. She watched the girl's pride puff out her chest, unaware that she was walking into a furnace. The Queen of Heaven leaned in, her eyes milky and treacherous, whispering the ultimate poison into the girl's ear. "If he truly loves you," the crone hissed, "why does he hide his glory? Is he ashamed of your mortal eyes, or is he merely a charlatan in a borrowed crown?" Semele's doubt bloomed like a nightshade flower, dark and lethal. She began to crave the truth more than she craved the man. when the sun dipped below the horizon and the first rumble of distant thunder shook the foundations of the palace, Semele prepared her trap. She would demand a gift, a promise carved in the unbreakable laws of the universe. She didn't know that Zeus was already trapped. Zeus entered the room, his form a shimmering mirage of gold and desire. He was drunk on her mortal scent, reckless in his pursuit of a moment's peace from the war on Olympus. Anything, he promised, his voice a low vibration that rattled the wine cups. Ask, and by the river Styx, it is yours. The words were a death sentence. The river Styx doesn't forgive, and it certainly doesn't forget. Semele smiled, a look of triumph crossing her face that would have been beautiful if it weren't so tragic. She opened her mouth to seal her own fate. "Show me your true self," she demanded, "the way you appear to Hera." The color drained from the air. Zeus's scream was the first crack of thunder that tore through the roof. He tried to pull the words back, to swallow the oath, but the Styx had already claimed the debt. He began to grow. The room could not hold him. The human skin split like wet paper, revealing the raw, white-hot core of a star. Semele didn't have time to scream. The sheer pressure of his divinity turned the marble to glass and the silk to smoke. She was vanishing. In the heart of the inferno, the girl became a pillar of salt and ash, her mortal frame incapable of witnessing the absolute. But as she dissolved into the searing light, the tiny glowing spark remained, the child. Zeus, weeping tears of molten gold, reached into the fire. He couldn't save the mother, but he would not let his prize perish in the embers. With a blade forged of pure will, he sliced open his own thigh, tucking the half-formed godly into the sanctuary of his divine flesh. He stitched himself shut with lightning, but the scent of burning hair remained. Hera watched from the clouds, her peacock feathers shimmering with the reflection of the funeral pyre. She had won, yet the victory tasted like ozone and bile. The child, Dionysus, lived a living scar on her husband's body, a constant reminder of the bed he had shared with a corpse. She turned away from the ruins of Thebes, her gaze already drifting toward the next horizon, the next girl, the next betrayal. The war wasn't over. It was merely entering a new, bloodier phase of divine domesticity, and the worst part was, she was just getting started. The marble floor of the Olympian inner sanctum felt like a frozen lake beneath Hera's sandals, cold enough to bite through the mythic leather. She walked with a calculated grace, her peacock-feathered robe shivering with every step, the iridescent eyes on the fabric seeming to blink in the low, flickering torchlight. Beside her, Poseidon smelled of stagnant brine and ancient grudges, his trident clutched white-knuckled in a hand that usually commanded the tides. Apollo stood in the shadows, his golden light dimmed to a sickly amber, while Athena sharpened a blade with a sound like a screaming bird. They were tired of the lightning, the ego, and the endless parade of mortal girls who had shared the king's bed. Hera's voice was a razor blade dipped in honey as she looked at the heavy, gilded doors of the royal bedchamber. "Tonight, we don't just defy a husband," she whispered, her eyes burning with a century of accumulated bile. "We dismantle a god." They moved toward the entrance, their shadows stretching like long, dark fingers across the mosaic floor. Zeus was dreaming of a new face, a new conquest, unaware that the air in the room had turned thick with the scent of a coming storm. The great doors creaked, a sound like the bones of the world breaking under an impossible weight. Inside, the king of the heavens sprawled across his silk sheets, his chest rising and falling with the rhythmic heave of distant gales. He looked almost human when he slept vulnerable, his majestic beard tangled with the remnants of ambrosia and the faint, lingering scent of starlight. Hera signaled with a sharp, jagged motion of her hand. Poseidon brought forward the cords of unbreakable adamant, Apollo the ropes of woven sunlight, and Athena the net of cold, calculated steel. They began to weave them together, a tapestry of divine resentment, looping the bonds around his massive wrists and ankles with the silence of spiders. They worked in a feverish, terrified harmony, tethering the sky to the earth with every tightening loop. One more turn of the cord around his throat, and the hierarchy of the universe would be severed forever. Zeus shifted in his sleep, a low growl of thunder vibrating deep in his throat, and the palace floor trembled beneath their feet. Hera froze, her hand hovering over his brow, her knuckles white with the strain of 1,000 years of repressed burning fury. She didn't breathe as the smell of ozone filled her lungs sharp and electric. The others retreated into the velvet shadows, their divine hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds. The king's eyelids fluttered, his eyes moving beneath the skin in the frantic, jerky dance of a dreamer lost in a vision. He mumbles a name not hers, never hers, and the insult is the final spark needed to ignite the dry tinder of her soul. She leaned in, her weight shifting as she pulled the final knot tight with a visceral snap. His eyes snapped open, and they were not blue like the Mediterranean or gray like the dawn, but white-hot, electric, and utterly terrifying. He tried to roar, to summon the lightning that lived in his marrow, but the chains were soaked in the magic of his equals, dampening his spark. He was a titan bound in a cage of his own kin's making, his muscles bulging against the adamant until the bed frame groaned. Kara leaned down, her face inches from his, her perfume smelling of jasmine and jagged glass. "The era of the tyrant is over," she whispered, her voice a lethal, beautiful lullaby that cut through his muffled rage. But as she reached for the fallen scepter on the nightstand, the room began to groan with an unnatural, suffocating pressure. The palace walls cracked, fissures snaking through the frescoes of former victories. Outside, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise and the oceans rose to swallow the coastal cities in a fit of synchronized grief. The conspirators, victory within their grasp, began to argue over the spoils of the coup. Poseidon wanted the sea and the sky. Apollo demanded the sun and the throne. Athena insisted on the law and the crown. Their voices rose into a cacophony of divine ego, a bickering match that threatened to tear the very fabric of reality apart. In the corner, hidden behind the heavy gold-threaded tapestries, a silver-footed goddess watched the chaos with narrowed eyes before slipping away. Tias dived into the churning, blackened surf to find the only thing in existence that Zeus feared more than his own wife. The air in the throne room turned cold enough to shatter stone into dust. Then came the sound of 1,000 joints popping, a rhythmic thudding that made the pillars of Olympus weep marble tears. From the abyss rose a nightmare of flesh and fury. Briareus, the 100-handed, the storm-born jailer of the old world. He did not walk. He undulates, a mountain of muscle and clutching fingers that filled the chamber until there was no room left for light or hope. The gods scattered like dry leaves before a hurricane as the giant leaned his massive, multifaceted shadow over the bound king. 100 hands reached out toward the golden chains, and for a heartbeat, it looked as though he might simply crush the life out of the King of Kings. Instead, the giant's fingers found the knots with the grace of a weaver and the strength of a shifting tectonic plate. He snapped the adamant chains as if they were rotted twine, the sound echoing like 100 gavels falling at once. Zeus rose, his skin glowing with the rekindled fire of the sun-gone supernova, the electricity returning to his veins with a deafening crack. The rebellion died in a pathetic whimper of fleeing footsteps and shattered pride. Hera stood alone in the center of the ruin, her crown tilted, her eyes defiant even as the shadow of her husband's hand fell over her like a heavy, golden shroud. The silence that followed was louder than any thunder, and the punishment he had envisioned was a nightmare she would have to live through for the rest of eternity. Zeus's fingers didn't just touch her, they seared. The air around Hera's wrists began to thicken, spinning into filaments of celestial gold that burned with the heat of a dying star. There was no mercy in his gaze, only a cold architectural calculation. He didn't scream. He didn't throw a lightning bolt. Instead, he reached into the very fabric of the sky and pulled. The floor of the silver palace dissolved beneath her sandals, replaced by the howling vacuum of the upper atmosphere. She reached for the marble, but her fingers found only the crushing weight of the first golden shackle. The ground was a memory, a patchwork of green and brown miles below, obscured by the churning gray of the storm. Zeus stood upon the lip of Olympus, his silhouette blotting out the sun as he let the golden chains slip through his calloused palms. Hera felt the jerk of bone-snapping, violent halt that left her dangling over the abyss. She was a trophy hung from the rafters of the universe. The wind tore at her silk chiton, screaming like a wounded beast. But the worst part was the absolute stillness of his expression as he produced the heavy, dark iron anvils, one for each ankle. He didn't drop them. He placed them with the tender precision of a jeweler. The moment the iron met the gold, the weight multiplied, dragging her joints toward the breaking point. Gravity became a predatory god of its own. Her spine elongated, Her ribs flared against the thin air, and the golden cuffs bit deep into the delicate skin of her wrists. She was the bridge between the celestial and the terrestrial. A living ligament stretched until the fibers of her divinity began to fray. He leaned over the edge, his fingers reaching for her throat again. "Do you see them, my queen?" His voice was a vibration in her marrow. Far below, the other rebels, Poseidon, Apollo, Athena, watched from the shadows of the clouds, their faces pale masks of cowardice. They offered no help. Not a single hand reached out to steady her swaying form. The sky turned a bruised purple, the color of a fresh trauma, as the night began to bleed into the horizon. Hera's breath came in ragged gasps, her lungs struggling to find purchase in the thin, freezing ether. She looked at him, her eyes burning with a defiance that invited his next cruelty. He didn't want her submission, he wanted her realization. This was the reconciliation of terror, a marriage renewed not in vows but in the absolute understanding of who held the lightning. He reached out and stroked her cheek, his thumb tracing the path of a frozen tear. It was a gesture of sickening intimacy, a reminder that the hand that strangled was the same hand that held the scepter. The anvils pulsed with a rhythmic thrum vibrating through her legs, sending shocks of agony upward. She tried to spit a curse, but her throat was a desert of dry, parched salt. The stars began to wheel overhead, indifferent to the Queen of Heaven, hanging like a common criminal. Each hour felt like an eon, the wind buffeting her body until she was nothing but a pendulum of pain. Zeus didn't leave her. He sat upon the edge of the precipice, watching her as if she were a piece of art he was still perfecting. He spoke of the seasons, of the mortals dying below, of the triviality of Breakup. He broke her spirit, not with a hammer, but with the terrifying boredom of his omnipotence. And then he leaned down low. "You will swear," he murmured, his lips grazing her ear. The chains tightened, singing against her bone. Hera looked at the monster who called her husband. The agony was a white-hot sun melting her pride. She whispered the oath, a promise that tasted like ash. He smiled, and with a flick of his wrist, the anvils vanished. She fell, not toward the earth, but back into his suffocating arms. The storm had passed, but the sky remained forever broken and hollow. Zeus didn't wait for the bruises on Hera's wrists to fade before his eyes wandered. Down in the river reeds, he found Io. To hide his latest prize, he didn't use mist, he used a curse. In a flash, the girl's skin hardened into hide. A moon-white heifer stood lowing in the mud, her liquid eyes filled with human terror. Hera's chariot descended, her smile sharper than a sacrificial blade. She stroked the animal's velvet nose, knowing exactly what pulsed beneath the fur. She didn't scream or strike. Instead, she asked for a gift that Zeus could not refuse. She wanted it. "Give me the beast," Hera whispered, her voice a silk noose. Zeus, trapped by his own deception, could only nod. He watched his beloved Io led away by a goddess whose mercy was a myth. Hera didn't just want a pet. She wanted a canvas for her agony. She summoned a creature born of the sun's spite and the swamp's rot. It was small, a mere speck against the vast blue sky, but it hummed with a vibration that made the very air ache. It was the gadfly, a tiny terror designed for one purpose. And then the first strike landed. The needle-sharp proboscis pierced the white hide, sinking deep into the tender flesh of Io's flank. It wasn't just a sting, it was a jolt of liquid fire that ignited her nerves. The heifer bolted. The elegant priestess-turned beast felt her mind fracture as the buzzing filled her skull, a sound like 1,000 saws cutting through bone. She galloped through the meadows, hooves churning the earth into a bloody froth. But the fly was faster. It clung to her like a shadow, a relentless piece of Hera's jealousy. There was no shade deep enough to hide from that eternal hum. Io reached the cliffs of the Ionian Sea, her lungs burning, her throat raw from lulling a name she could no longer speak. Every time her heart hammered against her ribs, the gadfly found a new patch of skin. Behind her, the laughter of the gods echoed in the thunder. Hera watched from her throne, sipping nectar that tasted of Io's salt tears. The goddess didn't want the girl dead. She wanted her moving. She wanted her to run until the world ran out of horizon, until rest became a forgotten dream. And that was when the madness truly settled. The heifer plunged into the waves. The heifer plunged into the waves, the cold salt stinging her fresh wounds. But even the ocean offered no sanctuary. The fly hovered above the spray, waiting for the moment she crested for air. It struck her eyelid. It struck the soft pink of her muzzle. Io's consciousness began to slip, the human girl drowning inside the bovine shell. She saw the stars as points of white-hot needles, the moon as a cold, unblinking eye. She crossed the Bosphorus, leaving a trail of exhaustion that stained the map of the world. But the very worst was yet to be endured tonight. Driven across the Scythian wastes, the heifer's hooves were worn to the bone. She encountered Prometheus, chained to his rock. But even the Titan's prophecy of her future glory couldn't dull the present torment. The gadfly was a master of rhythm. It would wait until she almost drifted into a daze, until her muscles finally twitched toward stillness, and then it would drive its venom home. Zeus watched from the clouds, his guilt a heavy stone, yet he did nothing. He preferred her pain over Hera's direct wrath. Then, the fly's buzzing began to change into something far more sinister, and much more loud still. The hum deepened into a roar. The gadfly didn't just sting now, it burrowed. Io collapsed in the sands of Egypt, her white hide gray with dust and dried blood. She was a broken vessel, a testament to a god's lust and a goddess's pride. She prayed for the end, but the sun only illuminated the shadow descending for the final strike. Her legs buckled, the sand swallowing her heat as the buzzing reached a crescendo that promised to tear her soul from its hide. The dust of Egypt settles, but the stench of divine betrayal drifts north, back to the marble halls where infidelity is the only law. Zeus didn't mourn Io. He simply looked for a new vessel to carry his thunder. He found it in the mortal queen Alcmene, but Hera's eyes were no longer weeping, they were burning coals. She watched the woman's belly swell, a ticking clock of her husband's shame. As the labor pains began, Hera didn't send healers, she sent a curse. The air in the chamber turned to lead, and the first scream was not the child's. Alcmene clawed at the bedsheets, her skin turning the color of bruised plums. Outside the door, the goddess of childbirth sat with her legs tightly crossed and fingers interlaced, a physical knot that bound the womb shut. Every contraction was a tectonic shift that led nowhere. 7 days of agony passed, the air thick with the smell of sweat and impending death. Zeus paced the heavens, blinded by his own arrogance, unaware that his queen had turned the miracle of birth into a slow-motion execution. Alcmene's heart began to falter, her spirit fluttering like a trapped moth against the cold window pane. Then came the trickery. A servant girl, Galantis, saw the divine hag sitting in her unnatural posture and shouted a lie. The child is born. The master is ecstatic. Startled, the goddess jumped up, uncrossing her legs, and the cosmic dam burst. The hero tumbled into the world, a golden lion of a babe, but Hera's fury didn't break. It simply solidified into a cold, translucent diamond of hatred. She realized she couldn't kill the boy, not yet, but she could ensure he was forged in the hottest fires of her resentment. She waited for the night the milk would flow. One night, while Hera slept in a bower of starlit lilies, Hermes crept into her chambers. He held the bastard babe to her divine breast, hoping the goddess's milk would grant the child immortality. The infant Heracles bit down with the strength of a titan. Hera bolted upright, a cry of shock tearing through the silent ether as she pushed the child away. The milk didn't just spill, it erupted. It surged across the black canvas of the void, a white frothing river of divine essence that carved a permanent scar across the heavens. The stars themselves trembled as the galaxy was born. That shimmering path across the night sky and the Milky Way became a constant reminder of Hera's unwilling charity. She looked up at the stars and saw her own violation. Heracles grew, his muscles like knotted oak, his spirit indomitable, but Hera was a patient gardener of misery. She waited until he had everything: a wife, children, a home, before she struck with the precision of a viper. She didn't use a blade, she used his own mind. She descended like a fog of madness, twisting his vision until his family looked like monsters. By the time the red mist cleared, he was. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. Heracles stood in the ruins of his life, his hands stained with the ultimate sin. Hera smiled from her throne, watching him crawl to the oracle, begging for a way to wash the red from his soul. She whispered into the ear of King Eurystheus, ensuring the penance would be a death sentence masked as duty. This was the birth of the 12 labors, a gauntlet of impossible horrors designed to grind the hero into the dirt. He was sent to face the Nemean lion, a beast with iron fur. He strangled the beast with his bare hands, but Hera only laughed from her golden height. For every labor he completed, she sowed a new field of thorns. She sent the Hydra, a many-headed nightmare that bled poison, and the Cerberus, the three-headed hound of the grave. Each victory for Heracles was a fresh insult to Hera, a cycle of divine domestic war that would never find peace. The breakup of the king and queen of the gods was no longer a private quarrel. It was a map of blood and stars that defined the very limits of human suffering. The scent of ozone and scorched earth drifts up to the peaks of Olympus. Down below, the plains of Ilium are a mosaic of bronze shields and spilling wine-dark blood. Zeus sits on his throne of clouds, his fingers drum-beating thunder against the armrest. Beside him, Hera is a statue of cold ivory, her eyes fixed not on the glory of the fight, but on the strings her husband pulls to ensure a Trojan victory. Their silence is a razor, cutting through the prayers of dying men. This is no longer a disagreement over a guest list. It is a siege of the soul. He favors the city of Priam, a sentiment etched in the way he deflects Greek arrows with a casual flick of a breeze. Hera watches his smirk, a twisted expression of divine ego that ignores the cries of her beloved Achaeans. Every time a Trojan spear finds its mark, she feels the cold iron in her own chest, not out of empathy for the mortals, but because Zeus is winning. This marriage has dissolved into a scoreboard of casualties. To break his will, she must first break his concentration, starting with a lie so beautiful it stings. She retreats to her inner chambers where light filters through curtains of spun gold. She bathes in ambrosia, smelling of crushed violets and secrets, scrubbing away the dust of her resentment until her skin glows with lethal radiance. From Aphrodite, she borrows the cestus, the girdle of irresistible longing, and binds it beneath her breasts. It hums with the power to make the wisest mind stumble and the hardest heart melt into wax. She is a queen preparing for an assassination, using desire as her blade. She steps onto the clouds, her target unaware of the coming storm. Zeus is perched on the heights of Gargarus. His eyes narrow as he watches Hector tear through the Greek lines. The air around him crackles with the static of his focus. But then the wind shifts. He breathes in a scent that belongs to the beginning of the world, the smell of Hera when she was first a bride and not yet an enemy. He turns, the thunder in his hand flickering out, replaced by a hunger that has slept for 1,000 years. She approaches with downcast eyes, playing the submissive wife, while her heart beats a war drum. "I am weary of our strife," she whispers, her voice a silken noose. Zeus reaches out, his massive hand trembling as he touches the curve of her throat. He forgets the clashing of swords and the fate of empires. He creates a canopy of golden mist to hide them from the sun, and the very earth beneath them erupts in crocuses and hyacinths to cushion their embrace. As he pulls her close, Hera smiles against his neck, a predator savoring the moment of the strike. While he falls into a divine stupor, the tide of the war begins to turn. Sleep, personified and bribed, blankets the king of gods in a heavy, sightless slumber. Down on the beach, the Greeks rally, their spirits ignited by the sudden absence of Zeus's lightning. Hera watches from the corner of her eye as her husband's favorites are slaughtered, the Trojan lines crumbling like dry sand. When Zeus finally stirs, the golden mist has evaporated into a cold fog. He looks down to see the slaughter of his chosen warriors and the Greek ships pushing forward. He turns to the woman beside him, his face contorting into a mask of celestial fury that threatens to shatter the sky. "You have played me for a fool," he roars, the sound flattening the forests of Ida. Hera does not flinch. She stands tall, her eyes reflecting the fires of the burning city below. Their divorce is written in the ashes of Troy, a testament to a love that turned into a scorched earth policy. They are bound by eternity, but separated by a sea of blood. Even as he threatens her with chains of gold, she knows she has won this round. Their marriage isn't just failing, it's a celestial catastrophe that will leave the world in ruins before the night is through. The air on Mount Ida tasted of ozone and ancient pine, thick with the scent of wild thyme crushed under the weight of divine expectation. Hera stood at the jagged precipice, her fingers tracing the silver embroidery of a veil that felt heavier than the sky she helped rule. She had bathed in the ambrosial streams of the immortal rivers, the oil of the charities still shimmering on her porcelain shoulders like liquid starlight. Every movement was a calculated ripple in the fabric of the divine. She wasn't just a wife waiting. She was a predator draped in silk and borrowed longing. But it wasn't the storm she feared, it was the man who rode within it. Zeus descended not as a husband, but as a tectonic shift. The crags of Ida groaned under his stride, and the very grass turned to gold where his sandals pressed. He smelled of rain and iron, a scent that once made her heart race with longing, but now only sharpened her resolve. He looked at her, and for a long moment the lightning in his eyes dimmed into a soft, dangerous glow. He reached out, his hand larger than a mortal's entire life, and let his fingers brush the hollow of her throat. The heat was unbearable, a searing reminder of the eons they had spent entangled. Then his grip tightened, and the honeyed words he spoke felt like a blade against her skin. "You come to me now," he rumbled, his voice the sound of boulders grinding in a deep abyss. Hera leaned into the touch, masking her loathing with a smile that had launched 1,000 myths. She had borrowed the embroidered girdle of Aphrodite, and its magic hummed against her ribs, a low-frequency pulse of pure, unadulterated desire. It wasn't love she was offering, it was a distraction. She let her breath hitch, a counterfeit of passion, and watched as the king of the gods succumbed to the oldest trick in the heavens. The mountain beneath him began to flower, hyacinths and crocuses erupting in a frantic bloom. But as he pulled her closer, Hera felt the cold weight of the golden chains he had once threatened her with. "Forget the Greeks," he whispered into the crook of her neck, his breath hot as a forge. "Forget the Trojans and the blood and the dirt." Hera laughed, a sound like breaking glass in a temple. "How can I forget the world we are tearing apart, Zeus? You favor the child of a sea nymph over the dignity of our own throne." The truce hung between them, thin as a spider's silk. They were two suns orbiting a dying planet, bound by a gravitational pull that was mostly spite. Every caress was a parry. Every kiss was a tactical feint. He didn't see the shadow of sleep, the god Hypnos, lurking in the mist behind her. The sky above Ida turned a bruised purple, the color of an ancient grape left to rot in the sun. Zeus pulled her down into the thick clover, his power radiating outward until the clouds formed a golden canopy, sealing them into private sanctuary of madness. Hera's eyes remained open, fixed on the horizon where the fires of Troy licked at the stars. She could feel the heartbeat of the god king against her chest, a rhythm of thunder and arrogance. He believed he was winning. He believed this momentary surrender meant she had finally folded. He was so drunk on his own divinity, he didn't realize that this embrace was the final seal on his empire's slow, agonizing collapse. Slowly, the tension left Zeus's massive frame. The hand that held the lightning bolt went slack, his fingers tangling in the dewy grass. Hypnos moved like a cooling breeze, touching the god's brow with the heavy weight of oblivion. Hera watched the light fade from Zeus's eyes as he drifted into a manufactured slumber. She didn't move for a long time, held captive by the corpse of her own affection. She looked at him, the father of gods, her brother, her tormentor, and felt nothing but the dry, parched sensation of a desert. The divorce wasn't a decree, it was this silence. She stood up, smoothing her robes, while the ground beneath the sleeping god began to tremble with the distant screams of his favorite heroes. Hera walked to the edge of the peak. Below, the Greek ships were silhouettes against a wall of flame. She had bought the Achaeans an hour of blood, and she had paid for it with the last shred of her soul. The golden chains Zeus had threatened her with were nothing compared to the chains of this eternal, rotting union. She looked back at the sleeping giant, the man who thought a mountaintop tryst could fix a broken cosmos. The air grew cold. The truce was over. As the first light of a false dawn touched the burning walls of Troy, Hera realized that they hadn't just ended a marriage. They'd ignited a celestial catastrophe that would leave the world in ruins before the night was through. The air on Ida tasted of spent lightning and deceptive jasmine. Hera watched the steady rise of the king's chest, a rhythm that once was the heartbeat of her world, but now felt like the ticking of a doomsday clock. She didn't feel the warmth of their embrace. She felt the frost of every betrayal calcifying in her marrow. This was the choreography they had mastered over eons, a violent clash, a deceptive peace, and then the inevitable sharpening of knives. He thought their union was a sanctuary, but the next storm would finally be the one that broke the sky. Zeus claimed to be the god of justice, a title that sounded noble until one realized his scales were balanced by his own fleeting desires. To him, justice was a whim, a thunderbolt thrown to settle a grudge or a decree whispered into the ear of a mortal queen. Hera, however, was goddess of law, the rigid, unyielding structure that kept the universe from collapsing into the primordial soup. To her, a vow was a blood seal, a contract written in the ink of the stars. He was a judge, but her eyes burned with the light of promises that demanded a reckoning. She remembered the scent of the first woman he had stolen, the taste of the first lie he had pressed against her lips like a poisoned grape. It was a pattern as predictable as the seasons, yet more destructive than any drought. He would wander, he would wound, and she would weave a web of retribution that tangled the innocent and the guilty alike. This was their holiness, a cycle of divine domestic abuse played out on a canvas of continents. Every time she forgave him, she lost herself, until she realized their love was a wildfire requiring the world as fuel. Below them, the plains of Troy were stained with the copper tang of blood, a direct consequence of their celestial dickering. Men died by the thousands because the king couldn't keep his word and the queen couldn't keep her temper. To Zeus, these mortals were pawns in a grand game of justice. But to Hera, they were the collateral damage of a law that had been ignored for too long. She watched a hero fall, his life spirit escaping in a pale mist, and felt a grim satisfaction. She turned away from the battlefield, unaware that the shadow behind her was moving. He woke with a start, the scent of ozone thickening as his eyes found hers. There was no tenderness in that gaze, only the heavy authority of a ruler who expected submission as his birthright. He spoke of balance, of the greater good that required his occasional indiscretions, framing his lust as cosmic necessity. It was his version of justice, a flexible morality that always favored the man with the lightning. Hera met his gaze with the stillness of a marble statue, her silence more cutting than any curse. Their confrontation was a war between forces that could neither win nor surrender. They were bound by more than just ancient oaths. They were the twin pillars of the firmament. If Hera left, the very concept of family would dissolve into the ether. If Zeus fell, the structure of power would shatter into a million jagged shards. They stayed together because the alternative was non-existence, a vacuum that would swallow the gods and men alike. So they retreated into their familiar roles, the philanderer and the termagant, the spark and the dampening wool. It was a miserable equilibrium, building a palace of resentment where the floors were slick with the blood of their history. As the sun finally crested the horizon, painting the ruins of Troy in a mocking shade of gold, Hera understood the true horror of their eternity. There would be no final goodbye, no grand exit into the sunset. They were trapped in a loop of betrayal and vengeance that would repeat until the stars burned out and the oceans turned to salt. This was the endless cycle, a dance of monsters. She wanted an end, but the nightmare was only just beginning. The scent of ozone doesn't fade, it simply migrates. It drifts from the smoking craters of ancient plains into the climate-controlled hum of glass-walled penthouses. You can see them still if you know how to look through the neon glare. Zeus isn't throwing bolts from a mountain anymore. He's the CEO in a bespoke suit, vibrating with a manic, restless energy that consumes every room he enters. Hera isn't lurking in a temple. She is the silent partner, the architect of a legacy, her eyes tracking every flickering cursor with the predatory patience of a hawk. The marble has turned to chrome, but the thunder was no longer in the sky. It was thrumming beneath the floorboards. We see them in the strobe lights of the nightclub and the filtered perfection of a social media feed. Every public meltdown, every scorched earth divorce played out in tabloid ink is just a new verse in their ancient, jagged song. We claim to be more civilized, yet we devour the spectacle of their mutual destruction like starving dogs. We turned their tragedy into a genre, a brand of high-stakes toxicity that fills our screens and fuels our algorithms. We tell ourselves it's just entertainment, a safe way to touch the fire without burning our hands, but the paparazzi were just priests at a new kind of altar. Why are we so obsessed with the wreckage of their marriage? Because they represent the terrifying scale of what happens when love is outstripped by the hunger for power. The modern archetype of the power couple is nothing more than a polished reliquary for their old grudges. We watch the billionaire philanderer and the vengeful socialite and feel a twisted sense of recognition. It's the lesson of the pantheon that greatness does not grant goodness. You can own the world and still be a slave to a petty heart. We toasted to their success, but the venom in the champagne was older than the bottle. This is the Olympian legacy, the realization that the most devastating wars aren't fought with armies, but with silence, infidelity, and the sharp edge of a public shaming. When we see a star fall from grace, caught in the web of their own ego, we are witnessing a ritual sacrifice that has been repeating since the Bronze Age. We don't want them to be happy. We want them to be loud. We want the lightning to strike so we can feel the heat from a distance. We watch the train wreck in slow motion, waiting for the impact, until the screen goes black and you see your own reflection in the crack. In every toxic loop where a partner returns to a betrayer, or a spouse builds a fortress of secrets, the ghost of their marriage is present. They taught us that forever isn't a promise of peace. It's a sentence. They are the patron saints of the "it's complicated" status, the divine source of the trauma bond. The lesson isn't how to fix the break, it's the horrifying truth that some things are built to stay broken. We keep swiping, keep watching, keep feeding the beasts of their narrative. And the god of thunder is now just a man with a blue check mark and a blackened heart. The ruins of Troy were just the beginning. The battleground has shifted to the boardrooms and the courtrooms where the weapons are NDAs and character assassinations. Here it is a need to send a gadfly to torment our rivals when a single leaked photograph can ruin a life in seconds. This cycle remains unbroken because we are the ones turning the wheel. We are the audience they never asked for, yet cannot live without. The tragedy is no longer a play, it's a lifestyle, a perpetual motion machine of resentment. They are trapped in us, and we are trapped in them, because the most dangerous thing about a ghost is that it doesn't know it's dead. The blood on the floor of the palace has dried into the stains on a designer rug. As the city lights flicker like dying stars, the silence between them grows heavy enough to crush the skyline. There is no escape from the archetype. They will do this again tomorrow and 1,000 years from tomorrow, dressed in new skins but carrying the same jagged shards of a shattered home. The dance of monsters continues, choreographed by our own voyeuristic desires. They are the mirrors we refuse to break, and in the dark, as the phone screen glows, you realize the nightmare didn't end, it just went viral. The stars above the peak are no longer burning, their hemorrhaging light flickering like the last gasps of a dying hearth. The air reeks of ozone and the metallic tang of ancient bitterness. A silence descends upon the white marble, a tectonic weight heavy enough to buckle the very foundations of the world and crush the skyline into dust. He stands with his lightning-scarred hands trembling and open, while she turns her back, her heavy velvet robes dragging through the grit of broken promises. There is no thunder here, only the dry, hacking sound of two ghosts trying to breathe the same poisoned air. This is the trap of the archetype, the recursive loop of the divine. Look closely at their eyes. They know. They understand that tomorrow the sun will rise, and they will inhabit new skins, wear different masks, and scream the same ancient insults in 100 different tongues. They are the jagged shards of a shattered home, endlessly trying to piece themselves back together, only to cut anyone who dares to reach out. We watch them because we cannot look away from the wreckage of our own hearts. They are the mirrors we refuse to break because we are terrified of the hollow emptiness that follows the crash. As the divine light fades into the cold, clinical blue glow of your smartphone, the realization hits like a physical blow. The nightmare did not end when the temples fell. It just went viral. Is a love that survives through eternal war a testament to devotion, or is it simply a shared addiction to the spectacle of our own destruction? Are we mourning their tragedy, or are we just hungry for the encore?